He posted a troubling picture on his personal Facebook page on November 30, 2012. It showed a cartoon character holding a blood-stained saw along with the caption, "Don't upset me, I'm running out of places to hide the bodies." Little did he know that he gave a clue to who he really was.
A beloved bookstore owner brutally murdered in her own shop. For nearly a decade, no answers. Until DNA, and one unexpected name, finally cracked the silence. November 30, 2010. South Salt Lake, Utah. The quiet calm of an ordinary Tuesday was shattered when 64-year-old Sherry Black was found brutally murdered inside her small bookstore, B&W Billiards and Book. Sherry wasn't just any bookstore owner. She was a lifelong Utah resident, a woman deeply rooted in her community and beloved by those who knew her. Born Sherry and Jarvis in 1946, she grew up in a loving home, surrounded by the values of family, hard work, and faith. From a young age, Sherry displayed an artistic eye and an entrepreneurial spirit. She loved books, fashion, and design, always drawn to things that told a story or carried a deeper beauty. That creative energy followed her into adulthood. In 1969, Sherry married Earl Black, the man who would become not just her partner in life but also her partner in business. Together, they built a life grounded in love and determination. They had one daughter, Heidi, who became the center of Sherry's world. Friends and neighbors often described her as a devoted mother and grandmother, someone who cherished family above everything else. Sherry was also admired for her unique skill in costume design and tailoring. She had an incredible talent for bringing fabrics to life, creating costumes, clothing, and detailed alterations that people sought her out for. Those who knew her often said she could make something extraordinary out of the ordinary. But perhaps her greatest passion outside of family was her bookstore. B&W Billiards and Books wasn't just a shop, it was a reflection of Sherry herself. A quiet space filled with rare and antique Latter-day Saint books, collectibles, and pool tables. It became a hidden gem in the community, a place where locals could stop by, chat with Sherry, and share her love of literature and history. That's why the events of November 30th were so unthinkable. On that morning, Earl Black tried calling his wife, but she didn't answer. Concerned, he drove to the shop. What he discovered would forever change his family's life. Inside the store, Earl found his wife's body. Sherry had been stabbed multiple times. The scene was violent, shocking, and utterly senseless. A woman known for kindness, creativity, and generosity was taken in the most brutal way imaginable. The murder left her family, her friends, and the entire South Salt Lake community reeling. Who would want to hurt Sherry Black? And why? Those questions would haunt investigators and loved ones for nearly a decade. After the discovery of Sherry Black's murdered body in her bookstore on November 30, 2010, detectives moved quickly. South Salt Lake Police, along with the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services, worked through the night. They secured the scene at B&W Billiards and Books, documented the blood, took photographs, sketches, chemical tests, everything they could. Witnesses were canvassed. Neighbors were asked if they had seen or heard anything unusual. But from the very start, although there was evidence, something important would remain missing. Detectives found evidence of a violent struggle, blood spatter, fingerprints, palm prints. Also, an item stood out. A men's belt, an Armani Exchange belt, was recovered at the scene. The belt had a sticker with the number 323 on the back of the buckle. It was clear that this belt belonged to someone more than just passing by. It was left behind, a critical clue. They collected DNA from the blood, also fingerprints and palm prints. But when they ran these prints, ran the DNA profile through CODIS, the combined DNA index system, nothing. No match. That meant two things. The suspect had not been arrested for a violent crime before, or else the arrest didn't produce prints or DNA in the database. Perhaps the suspect was new or had no prior record. The department offered a reward. Earl Black and Sherry's family, understandably desperate for any lead, offered $50,000. Years later it was raised to $250,000. Still, nothing. Such rewards often bring out tips, leads, people hoping to help or hoping to profit, but in this case, none of the tips led anywhere fruitful. Meanwhile, investigators explored newer technological tools. In about 2011, evidence pointed toward a broader population group using DNA phenotype statistics. They could estimate, for example, whether the suspect had a certain skin tone, hair color, eye color, etc., based on the DNA found. It gave a rough sketch, a rough identity. But no one recognizable stepped forward, no matching person came under suspicion. As the investigation continued through 2012 and beyond, police re-interviewed neighbors and witnesses multiple times. They conducted behavioral profiles. The store's location was somewhat secluded. The layout meant someone could enter without being immediately noticed. That raised the possibility of someone familiar with the area or the shop. Perhaps someone Sherry knew, or someone who knew the flow of traffic in and out of that location. But lead after lead failed. Partial fingerprints turned inconclusive. Witness memories were fuzzy or contradictory. Some people recalled seeing someone near the shop that day, others did not. Investigators also reviewed the possibility that it was a targeted assault rather than a random robbery, since nothing was stolen. All her valuable books were still inside, the cash drawer was intact. That pointed away from theft and pointed more toward something personal or something more sinister. There was growing frustration, not just from detectives, but from Sherry's family. They held vigils, gave interviews, pleaded for leads. The case made headlines locally. But year after year, it seemed the investigation was stuck. The forensic evidence was there, but no identity to match it to. The prints, the DNA, the belt, each a puzzle piece but no frame to place them in. This cold stretch lasted years. Police units specializing in cold cases were set up, resources increased somewhat. Still, until 2017, none of the evidence had pointed clearly to a suspect. It seemed the case might be one of those that would linger in open files, unsolved, unanswered, a dark mark in Salt Lake County's record. Every so often, new hope flickered, a witness who thought they recognized the belt, a tip about someone connected to a pawn shop, rumors of someone who disappeared around that time. All were followed, all investigated. Sometimes investigations would exhaust leads and then go back to the start. Fingerprints, DNA, witness statements. Through all this, the weight of unanswered questions pressed on. Why leave that belt? Why no signs of forced entry or theft? Who could carry that much hate to enter someone's store, someone's life, and commit such violence? And what was the suspect's story? Someone young, unknown, someone whose name was not yet in any database. For nearly 9 long years, the family of Sherry Black lived in uncertainty, haunted by questions that had no answers. Who killed her? Why? And when would justice come? In those years, the case seemed frozen in time. Detectives had DNA. They had fingerprints. They even had the Armani exchange belt left behind at the scene. But without a match, all they could do was wait, hoping that one day, somewhere, the suspect would be arrested for another crime, and their DNA would finally be entered into the national database. But that day never came. Every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday reminded Sherry's family of what had been stolen from them. Her husband, Earl Black, had to carry the weight of life without the woman he had been married to for decades. Her daughter, Heidi, struggled with the loss of her mother while also raising her own family. The Black family often described those years as a cloud that would not lift, a pain that never dulled, because it was tied to something unfinished. Sherry wasn't forgotten by the community, either. Vigils were held. Candles lit. People would stop by the store and leave flowers, prayers, or note. News outlets occasionally brought the case back into the headlines, especially when police announced new reward amounts. At one point, the family put up a $250,000 reward for information that could lead to the killer. But even that massive figure drew in only false leads and dead ends. For detectives, it was just as frustrating. They reopened the case multiple times, re-interviewed witnesses, checked pawn shops, checked sales of similar Armani belts, and worked with the Utah Crime Lab on every forensic advancement possible. But without a suspect in Cody's, the investigation was like pushing against a locked door. And as years passed, the silence became deafening. By 2017, the trail was considered cold. Officially, the case was labeled unsolved, but not closed. For the family, though, the lack of progress was devastating. Heidi Miller, Sherry's daughter, would later describe how grief turned into purpose, how she realized she had to make sure no other family would feel abandoned by the system. She started the Sherry Black Foundation, devoted to supporting law enforcement and victim families in cold case investigations. It was a way to turn tragedy into advocacy, but also a way to keep her mother's story alive. Meanwhile, the suspect remained a ghost. No name, no face, no connection. Just DNA sitting in a lab file, waiting for science to catch up. And yet, despite the silence, one truth endured. The case was never forgotten. Not by the family. Not by investigators. And not by the city of South Salt Lake. For 9 years, Sherry's loved ones carried the heavy burden of waiting. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for an arrest. Waiting for justice. 2018 changed everything. Investigators turned to a new tool, genetic genealogy. After nearly 8 years of silence, cold leads, and dead ends, this new scientific frontier would crack the case open. In 2017, police working on Sherry Black's murder case sent the DNA collected from the crime scene, the male blood sample, to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specializes in new DNA technologies. Using a process called DNA phenotyping, Parabon generated 3 snapshot composites of what the suspect might look like at ages 25, 38, and 52. These snapshots included estimates of physical features: skin tone, hair color, eye color, face shape. It was not perfect, not a photographic portrait, but a tool to instantly narrow the field. Detective Ben Pender, from the Unified Police Department, took over the investigation in 2018. He began re-reviewing all evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and importantly, collaborating with genealogists to build out family trees connected to the DNA sample. These genealogists worked by comparing the unknown DNA profile with DNA from distant relatives through public genealogy databases. Through this work, investigators aimed to trace back from distant cousins to more closely related family members, parents, siblings, maybe even the suspect himself. They followed multiple branches of a genetic tree, contacting individuals who might share DNA with the suspect. Over time, leads emerged. One branch led them to a family in Southern California, which provided key information. A child in that line, adoption records, and other family connections revealed names and clues that police hadn't previously known. Then, in early October 2020, police finally collected a DNA sample from Adam Antonio Spencer Durborow. That sample was sent to the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services. It was compared to the crime scene DNA. Hours later, the breakthrough became official. It was a match. The blood at the scene, the male DNA profile, now tied directly to a living person. Along with DNA, detectives confirmed fingerprints and palm prints from the crime scene matched those belonging to Durborow. Durborow was arrested on October 10, 2020, and later, during interrogation, he confessed to Sherry Black's homicide under Miranda. This breakthrough did not come from one moment alone but from years of patience, of new science, and methodical detective work. The phenotyping gave a sketch that narrowed the suspect's physical traits, genetic genealogy traced family lines, old evidence collected in 2010 suddenly found purpose, then DNA, fingerprints, palm prints, all aligned. Finally, the case that had stood silent for so long had an answer. In October of 2020, after nearly a decade of unanswered questions, the breakthrough everyone had hoped for finally came. The DNA pointed to a local man, Adam Antonio Spencer Durborow. Durborow, then 29 years old, was arrested on October 10, 2020 in connection with the 2010 murder of Sherry Black. He lived in Orem, Utah. The arrest came after years of forensic work, genealogical tracing, and patient detective work. Here's what led to that moment. The crime scene evidence from 2010 had included male blood, palm prints, and fingerprints, but at the time, none of that matched any known suspect in the Cody's database. Through genetic genealogy and DNA phenotyping, law enforcement was able to build a profile of what the unknown suspect might look like, estimates of hair color, skin tone, eye color. This wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to narrow the field. Once Durborow was identified via genealogy, police obtained a DNA sample from him. That sample was compared to the crime scene DNA and confirmed a match. The blood at the scene, the palm prints, fingerprints all aligned. After the matching was confirmed, Durborow was given his Miranda rights, and in interrogation he confessed to the homicide. The revelation stunned Sherry's family. For years, they had waited with heavy hearts. When the news came, it was relief mixed with heartbreak. Finally, they had a name. But it also raised more questions. Why had it taken so long for DNA and genealogy tools to be applied? What might have been missed in those early years? How did Durborow avoid detection, even though traces of evidence were always there? Durborow was only 19 years old at the time of the murder. He had some prior run-ins with petty theft, no record of violent felonies that matched what investigators had hoped to find in Cody's. That absence is what made the case cold for so long. The match didn't come suddenly. It came through years of groundwork, sometimes tedious, sometimes frustrating. Investigators re-examined evidence, applied newer technology, re-interviewed witnesses. When everything finally aligned, DNA, fingerprints, confession, the pieces fit together. This moment was more than just an arrest. It marked the point where justice, delayed, became possible. Adam Antonio Spencer Durborow was just 19 years old when Sherry Black was murdered. At the time, he lived barely a mile from her bookstore, a short distance that, years later, would feel haunting. Adam grew up in a fractured home. His biological mother lived close by, but much of his upbringing was shaped by foster and stepfamily ties. Reports suggest his stepmother cared for as many as a dozen foster children, creating a crowded and complex household. Adding to the turbulence, his foster father would later face charges related to child pornography, a shadow that only deepened the instability of Adam's world. As a teenager, Adam already had brushes with the law. His juvenile record included petty theft, and at least one troubling case involving assault and attempted rape. Though he avoided major convictions as an adult, these early offenses hinted at a darker path. For years, no one suspected the young man living quietly in South Salt Lake. He blended into the background, his life appearing unremarkable. But behind the surface, the seeds of violence had long been present. When Adam was finally arrested in 2020, 9 years after the crime, his family issued a statement. They described themselves as devastated, calling it a foreign and dark time. They offered condolences to Sherry Black's loved ones, while grappling with the unthinkable truth that their son stood accused of a brutal murder. It was a shocking revelation. The Durborow family's grief intertwined with that of the Black family, each carrying a different but heavy kind of sorrow. Following his arrest in 2020, Adam Antonio Spencer Durborow faced the slow but steady march of justice. For Sherry Black's family, the wait had already spanned nearly a decade. Now, they found themselves in courtrooms, reliving the horror of her murder, hoping the legal process would finally bring them closure. Durborow was charged with aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and aggravated robbery, charges that reflected the brutality of the crime. Prosecutors made it clear. This wasn't just a tragic killing. It was an act that tore apart a family and shocked an entire community. As the proceedings unfolded, disturbing details emerged about Durborow's past. He had been a teenager when he killed Sherry Black, just 19 years old at the time. He admitted that he had struggled with violent thoughts for years. Investigators revealed writings he had kept, where he expressed fascination with murder and violence. These revelations painted a chilling picture, raising questions about whether Sherry's death had been a spontaneous act, or the fulfillment of dark fantasies brewing for years. Then came the turning point. In October 2021, nearly 11 years after Sherry's death, Durborow stood before the court and entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder. For the first time, the family and the public heard him acknowledge what he had done. In 2022, the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. To many, it was a relief. Durborow would spend decades behind bars. For Sherry's daughter, Heidi Miller, and her husband, Earl Black, the sentence was both a measure of justice and a reminder of the permanent loss they still carried. Heidi later shared how difficult it was to sit in the courtroom, listening to the details of her mother's murder, and facing the man who took her life. Yet she also spoke of gratitude, for the investigators who never gave up, and for the breakthrough that finally gave them answers. For the city of South Salt Lake, the conclusion of the trial closed one of the region's most haunting chapters. A beloved bookstore owner, wife, mother, and grandmother had been stolen from them. But justice, delayed for more than a decade, had finally arrived. The sentencing of Adam Durborow in 2022 brought an official close to a case that had stretched across more than a decade. But for the people who loved Sherry Black, the aftermath was about more than a verdict or a prison sentence. Sherry's daughter, Heidi Miller, described her mother as her best friend, someone she could turn to for advice, comfort, and encouragement. Losing her in such a violent way created wounds that will never fully heal. Heidi said that facing her mother's killer in court was surreal, a painful reminder that justice doesn't erase grief. For Earl Black, Sherry's husband, the trial brought back the darkest day of his life, the day he found her murdered inside their family bookstore. He carried the weight of that memory every single day. Yet through it all, he and his family leaned on their faith, their community, and the love Sherry had given them to move forward. Beyond her family, Sherry Black's death left a lasting mark on the entire Salt Lake community. She was known not just as a bookstore owner, but as a woman of kindness, faith, and generosity. Friends described her as someone who always made time for others, whether it was through her passion for books or simply offering a listening ear. Her case also changed the way Utah law enforcement approached cold cases. The successful use of genetic genealogy in 2018 proved that even the oldest investigations could find answers. It inspired agencies across the state to take a second look at other unsolved crimes, giving renewed hope to families still waiting for justice. In the years since, Sherry's story has become more than just the account of a crime. It stands as a reminder of the persistence of investigators, the resilience of families, and the power of modern science to bring truth out of the shadows. But it also leaves us with a sobering thought. For every case like Sherry's that finally sees justice, there are countless others still waiting in the dark. Families without answers. Communities without closure. And so, as we reflect on Sherry's life, a loving mother, wife, grandmother, and friend, we are reminded that justice may be delayed, but it is never forgotten. This case proves that even after years of silence, the truth can still find its way to light. But it leaves us all with one haunting question: how many more answers are still buried in the cold? For Sherry's family, justice came late, but it came. Her memory lives on in every turn of a book's page. This case proves justice can wait but never vanish. Still, one haunting question remains: how many more answers are buried in the cold?